What the fuck is a horny-handed proletarian?
Yeah, it's like they're calloused hands, man.
Horny hand
Yes.
is callous?
Yeah, oh my God. Johnson, dude.
Hello.
Hey, welcome.
Welcome to Left Unread.
My name is Will.
My name is Aaron. This is a podcast where two dudes engage in radical self-education.
Yeah, we're just two guys reading.
Having a good time.
Yes, we're having a good time. We're engaging in a radical self-education. We're reading theory. Not this week, though. This week we read history.
Yeah, this one's a little different. For this episode, we read The Paris Commune, A Revolution in Democracy by Donny Gluckstein. And I think that this came from a space where we'd read enough theory up until this point where we felt like all of that theory was making reference to the Paris Commune in one way or the other. And we felt like we lacked, or at least I don't want to speak for you, I felt that I lacked a lot of historical context to understand what those references meant, what they intended to teach us about the theory that we were reading, or how they were supposed to be applied, how that theory was supposed to be applied based on the historical context. So I wanted to know more about what the Commune was all about. So we read this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I know nothing about French history. You know, I thought Les Mis was about the Paris Commune. It's not. It's not even about the French Revolution. I found out it's about a different failed revolution.
Oh.
That's okay. And I agree. It's, you know, if we're thinking of the Commune as like a form that we're going to look towards in the future to organize our own society, then it's important to understand what that form actually entails. You know, we're not just talking about this nebulous idea of the commune, like the commune and communism is literally stemming from the Paris Commune, according to Marx, Engels, Lenin, all of those, you know, founding members. So I was really excited to dive into this book because I was interested to see not only what, how, and why, but, you know, what does it actually look like to organize a society in this communistic fashion?
Yeah, and knowing that it was a relatively short-lived phenomenon, the Paris Commune, understanding what maybe worked about it, what didn't, and what lessons should be taken from that moving forward, you know?
Yeah, and it definitely, I mean, you know, it definitely opened up some questions in my mind.
100%.
Yeah.
And I will say I also really loved the way Donny Gluckstein organized this kind of history of the Paris Commune. It's not necessarily told in a chronological fashion, and it's certainly not like just a bland, dry retelling of history, but instead kind of looks at the achievements of the commune, what it was able to accomplish, and then look at the struggles of running the commune, the resistance to the commune,
right,
and then ultimately what are the interpretations that came from it in hindsight, you know, now 150 years later.
Yeah. And even reading about the destruction of the commune, I think was kind of enlightening to me because, you know, it brought forward the biggest question in my mind is like, how do you fucking win this thing? Mm-hmm. It's like, say a revolution does happen, passive voice, like, what the hell, how are those revolutionaries supposed to win, right? How are they supposed to create that society?
Yeah. And so I guess just as a general comment about the structure of the episode, you know, we've already established in the first 4 episodes of this podcast that we kind of introduce the thinker, introduce the work in a historical context, and then dive into it, specifically looking at the theory that's presented within. But obviously we can't do that with a historical retelling.
Yeah.
Because it's not theory. So I think we just kind of talk about our thoughts about the text and see where that takes us.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can just follow the same pathway that he does. So I guess let's start with the achievements.
Yeah. To start, the first thing that really jumped out to me in this section, the chapter called The Commune's Achievements, there's a section called The Commune in Action. First of all, I will say something I appreciated as a reader is that he breaks up each chapter into little sections, and most of those sections even have a little subtitle that is a reference to something within the section.
Yeah.
And I fucking love all of the little subtitles. Like one is Arise Ye Starvelings from Your Slumbers. It's just like great fucking stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's like
the epigraph,
you know, it's like one of those for each little chapter.
Yeah. And it's fun because it's self-referential to something that happens in that section, obviously. So then you get to it and you're like, ooh.
Yeah. Oh, well.
It pays off. But on page 13, there's a section called The Commune in Action. And I really love the way that it starts. He begins with a quote that reads, "Grand schemes for radical change, we are always being told, can never succeed because they are, quote, unrealistic. Realism in this sense means continuing to tolerate the inequity and injustice of the current economic system. The Commune did not dream of radical change. It made it a reality.
Yeah.
And that really spoke to me. I wrote radical optimism next to that. I think it's been no secret, even in just the first few episodes of this podcast, that I struggle a lot with depression that comes from a kind of a political fatalism and a form of existential nihilism or something about the fate of persons, human and non-human persons on this planet. And I just appreciated this idea that, like, it doesn't have to be that way. And the Commune is proof that if you can organize the people, you can turn something that is considered an unrealistic dream into a reality.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that I thought that was a great way for me to jump into this book and be open to its lessons, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, the vibe that you get from reading this is that it's not that the Commune was flawless. That's clearly not what he's saying here. But like the pathway that the Commune was on, like the route that the Commune was on, was one that was really interesting and had a lot of potential. And if it hadn't been, destroyed, who knows how it could have gone. I mean, the author does a lot to talk about how kind of on the edge the Commune was to success if like just certain things had happened. And I think that like the future potential that's in the Commune is something that's really exciting. I mean, I'm not saying that it would have done amazing, fantastical things, changed the world, but like, the fact that it died so early is a little hopeful, honestly, because not that they died, but it's the thing is like, we didn't have to see any failings or failures or like the worst thing that comes out of the Commune here is that they killed hostages, in response to the terror being imposed upon them, in like a last ditch effort. So I don't know. I mean, it's kind of this like picturesque figure or this saint. Like the Commune is like an event that can be gestured towards without many flaws, really.
As opposed to something like Leninism being bastardized into Stalinism kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to uphold the Soviet Union and be like that, look at this is the goal. People will always be like, well, what about X, Y, Z all the way down the fucking line?
Yeah,
right. But there's many examples out there of communism that like showed the potential without the same kind of failings, And I'm not even thinking of it in just like a term of messaging. I just like the idea of the Paris Commune because it's something that's really exciting. It's metropolitan. I mean, it exists within the first world. It's in France of all places. And I think that it just really has a lot of potential there that could give some revolutionary optimism. And also I had the thought that 1871, not that far away, Yeah,
it's not that long ago. And there was something about at least Gluckstein's writing about the Commune that felt very immediate in a way that to me made it feel much more attainable.
Yeah.
I think of projects like any sort of project that's going to lead toward revolution to be something that is a long process of very hard, laborious organization. And I'm not trying to discount that there were people, working, doing things like that, radical organizers around the time of the Commune, but it felt very much immediate. Like here was a circumstance, they organized enough people around it and they fucking did something about it. They weren't dilly-dallying reading theory for 30 years, trying to figure out what to do and organize a plan. They just fucking took it. And if not for, outside interference, who knows what it could have done,
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, there's actually a lot of interesting parallels too in the organizers of the Commune and like the kind of left unity that we're seeking. I mean, despite the fact that like that kind of internal debate led to a lot of the disorganization, I think that there are like direct parallels in the leftists of the Commune and the leftists of like today, where you have like, Proudhonists, which might be, more like an anarchist crowd. The Blankists or the Blankwists, I guess. That's definitely more of like a vanguard party if you were to look at it in that way. And they even have like social democrats, like the neo Jacobins are there just to fuck shit up and
Jacobin. I've always said Jacobin.
Jacobin? I don't know. Let's like
no.
It's fucked, man. Maybe it's Jacobin. Who knows?
Oh, I think you're right. Motherfucker. God damn
it. Yeah. So, I mean, but it's just so interesting because, like, man, I guess this kind of leftist infighting has always been around.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's true.
there is something to be said about the spontaneous nature. I like, that is, there was organization there, but it was mostly like a grand response. I mean, if we're thinking about situations that have revolutionary potential, I think it's, if you want to draw like a modern parallel, you could see this kind of thing happening coming from any of the modern protests. If there was just like a little more maybe directional input or organizational input, there's not like a modern situation that reflects the situation that Paris was in when the Commune happened. But I think that there is potential for that kind of spontaneous mass uprising. One quote that I had pulled is actually on page 5 here in the block quote. He says, "Its fundamental greatness is that it's made entirely by people as a collective communal revolutionary undertaking, anonymous, unanimous, and for the first time without leaders. Nothing of the personal, of the individualistic. There was no surprise attack, no coup de main, but a massive achievement strong in its authority of the workers, the natural power, spontaneous, not false, born from the public conscious of the vile multitude which has been provoked and attacked and now legitimately defends itself." So I like that. That defense is really what spoke to me there, because it's saying like this revolution is happening in reaction, and that kind of mirrors what Engels was saying way, way back when he's saying that revolution is not something that's arbitrary. It's like a reflection of the circumstances.
Yeah, and one of the questions that I had lingering from this was around the circumstances that lead to revolution, because I think there are a few references to that in the text and the telling of the story of the Paris Commune specifically. And I feel like we learned the same thing about the October Revolution in Russia, in that it's like the circumstance has to be just kind of just right.
Yeah, I think, the idea that like the revolution will come from the contradictions of capitalism becoming too strained is kind of the same way I feel about these circumstances and in the October Revolution, because it's like the siege, like the pressure of the war had become so great that the power of the current government was like inadequate.
Yeah.
It was literally stretched to the point where the people said like, we must do something better than this. And that's when they organized and rose up, and all it took was like, a number of like leftists, revolutionaries, radicals to not only like utilize that same mass movement, but also to start to invoke that social change. There's a lot of people in here, especially the generals they're talking about leading the army, that aren't specifically radicals, but they're there because like that's the revolutionary will of the people.
Yeah.
That was something I appreciated. It's like, I know not everyone in Paris is like a communist. That's not what's happening here, but everyone suddenly is working towards these same goals, and they have this kind of revolutionary fervor because, I don't know, they've started to attack the basis of the old society, and they find that they can't stop. It's almost as if, as Lenin was saying in State and Revolution, it's like once that process begins, it's like it can only snowball up to the extent, to the whatever I'm saying here.
Yeah, it's just a rational reaction to the circumstances that are being imposed upon all people. So you don't have to be a communist to recognize that things are shit and want to do something to go against it.
Something I will say really hilarious about this book is that it was written in 2006, and he makes a lot of reference to like popular protests to the Iraq War.
Yeah.
And it's really funny looking at that from 2023, because it's like
2024.
Fuck. No. Yes. 2020 from the present. It's funny looking at that from the current day, because it's like, what protest, what reaction? Because looking back at hindsight, you lived through that. I was like a baby.
There was an anti-war movement that was, very vocal at that time. But from my view, being like relatively involved in politics at the time, I was in my late teens, early 20s at that time. And that's when I was getting involved in organizing and direct action. There was certainly a pretty strong anti-war sentiment, but nothing that even at the time I thought and looked at and saw its revolutionary potential.
Yeah, it's funny to hear Donny Gluckstein write about this with like an optimism, and looking back, it looks like nothing but a complete dud.
Yeah, I think the nearest probably parallel we have to any sort of strong social movement would be around George Floyd's murder and the protests that came around that. That actually felt like, at least to me in the moment, that it had a revolutionary fervor.
Yeah. Not to speak like it's a silver bullet or anything, but I think that, if it were possible to connect the mass consciousness to class consciousness, wow, bars, then like that protest could have, if the people could be made to see that like the issue here. Fuck off. You know exactly what I mean, though, is that like if the people were to make the connection that like the issues here are systemic and that the solution comes from a change in system, like then that's how that kind of potential can be drummed up. You know, it's just that the left has been a fucking failure since it was obliterated. And again and again and again, every 20 years, it's fucking obliterated again. You know?
Yep. Certainly he speaks a lot at the end of the book about the difference between reform and revolution. And I think that what you're speaking on is a finger on the pulse there with this idea that like the protests around George Floyd's murder specifically were all driven around the narrative of police reform, not like the abolition of fucking state power, you know, being used against the people, which is, it's just weird how, I don't know, if only we could take that one half step forward to recognize.
It's crazy to think that defund the police was too radical of a slogan when it's like, no, man, we need to destroy the police.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I was looking for it and I found a couple of quotes here. He does talk in the first chapter about the conditions that create revolutionary potential. He's talking about the Paris Commune, and he says that this event was precipitated by a government financial crisis, which already created some kind of desperate conditions. What's the word? Some disillusionment.
I think that like the biggest thing, probably the biggest organizational thing that led to the Commune was really the fact that one, the masses were a part of the National Guard, and that organization was already bottom up. It was already a democratic organization, more or less. And then secondly is that the government acting stupidly was like, let's get rid of the dole here. Like, let's take the wages away from these people. And it's like they didn't realize that so many people were acting on it. I mean, that's, I hate to talk about history as if they're all dunces, but there's so many times reading this where I'm like, they're fucking idiots, you know, not only the government, but also the Commune. Not to get ahead of myself, but during the fall of the Commune, the reason that they get overrun is that like 8,000 Parisians were attending like a show. You know, and since they were they had this like anarchic disorganization, troops were able to breach the walls of Paris. And it's just like, what do you mean? Like, did they just leave the gate? Did they leave it open? Did they just have it cracked? Come back, you know, going out for a smoke? And it's like, whoops, I let in 200,000 troops.
Yeah, don't want it to lock behind you, so you put a chair in the door.
Yeah, so it's you know, there's so many times here where I'm like, that's so fucking stupid.
Yeah.
And this is one of those times where they're like, yeah, we know that the masses of Paris are armed, organized, and also we are paying them. Let's stop paying them. You know, they'll just be armed and organized and unpaid. Really dumb decision there.
Yeah. You would hope someone would have seen that in the moment, but it's also much easier to see in hindsight.
That is true. That is true, you know, but also like, I don't know, the bourgeois are stupid.
Well, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I'm just going to reference a tweet every episode apparently, but one of my favorite tweets of all time is like, the cognitive dissonance from being rich is like being kicked in the horse every single day. Being kicked in the head by a horse every day. It's like, yeah. To talk about, so we're talking about the current conditions, you know, on page 53, something I thought was really interesting was whichever Bonaparte this is, I guess the third. The third, yeah. But Napoleon is the first, right?
Yeah. This was just like his fucking cousin or something?
Dude. Yeah, it's his grandson or some shit. Like I don't know if it was actually his grandson.
But he just called himself Napoleon the Third to win political favor,
Yeah. But regardless, on page 53, there's an interesting description where he says that, you know, some scholars consider that Bonaparte regime to be like proto-fascist, you know, because not only did it have, it had like that insane authoritarianism, but also a populist kind of idea.
Yeah, I have that same quote about the prototype of fascism there, which again, the conditions being created that make it a mass organization to stand against it much more likely or possible, I guess.
Yeah, I hate to sound like an accelerationist, but it's like, how extreme do you have to get before the snap happens?
Yeah. What is the line that you have to toe toward fascism before it becomes something that the mass struggle will stand against?
It's so gross, though, because it's like, it shouldn't be a goal, you know? I don't want to spur the situation just because they think it will create revolutionary potential. You know what I mean?
For sure.
It's like people saying that's like, well, we give them Trump so they can see how bad it is. It's like, that's definitely not what people fucking need.
Yeah, that's fucked as a position of privilege, too.
Yeah. I agree.
But the question, I think, stands. Like, how can you see, like, this quote about the prototype of fascism, this combination of populism and authoritarianism, is like, okay, so those were the political conditions at the time that made enough people stand up. Their rent was too high, their pay was being reduced or taken away, and they're also seeing reduced political power around them because of the war. And then they're seeing people like Napoleon III come in and create this like prototypical fascist state. That's enough for people to be like, we're fucked. We got to do something.
Yeah.
And yet here we are again, 150 years later. We see rent is too high. Wages are down.
Yeah,
like
profits are down. Like
we're seeing this prototypical fascist state creeping into, supposed American democracy. Like what is, I'm not suggesting that we need to make it worse for people to organize against it. My question is, why are we not organizing against it right now?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I guess the answer lies within all the levers. I mean, all the mechanisms of power that the hegemony has over us. It's like there's all these different means to either like dissuade, ameliorate, or I don't know, just keep the revolution down. It's so fucked, man.
Yeah.
It's just really shit because they have it so they have it so divided up, but it's like all of the anger and frustration goes to each other, and it's not directed towards like the top.
Yeah, well, I think part of that comes from manipulation of mass media and the existence of mass media in a way that much of the historical account that's being given here in Gluckstein's book is coming from newspapers that were articles that were being published concurrent to the Commune and from the Commune. But like that was it. That was the media that they had. So I think like one, being globalized has created a dilution of understanding because it's certainly desensitizing.
Yes.
This idea that there's so much happening, so many things going on at any given time that it's easier and in fact for a lot of people preferable to step away from all of it.
Right.
The number of people that have no interest in knowing what's going on in Gaza right now as an example, just because they're trying to get through their own daily toiling or whatever.
Toiling is good.
Is one thing. So like the abundance of media has created a desensitized dilution in response. And then also, like you said, there are other mechanisms that are being weaponized against the people to create conflict within. Like, obviously, like the isms are manifestations of that kind of state power being weaponized against folks, racism, homophobia, things like that.
Yeah.
We're fighting about fucking bathroom bills instead of actually organizing against state power that's standing against the people's liberation, It's fucked.
I guess organize,
That's easier said than done. Like they did talk about the red clubs in here, which I liked quite a lot.
Mm. The red clubs are interesting because what's the parallel, right? I don't know. I feel like it's not
Discord.
I was just about to say like the forum, the chat room, but those are so closed off. They don't make. I think the part of that is that they don't hold a physical space. A club on the street, something that you walk by and see people inside, you might go. But if you have to type in something into Google to find out, it's like finding a Marxist website, I don't think it's unintentional that like the big sites are like Marxism.com, because those are such a direct thing. You could literally type, if you knew nothing about communism and you were like Marxism.com, that would take you to a place where you could actually find some information. But if you want to get into these specific discussions, it's a lot harder to find those spaces because they don't hold a physical space, where I think this is a strange parallel, but I think that the clubs do that,
Well, and those sorts of online spaces have a tendency to be so closed also in a way that is not particularly welcoming to people that don't already know what's going on. And I mean, these red clubs, for example, it sounded like the description of them was, for some people, that was the place that they went that was heated.
Yeah.
And so they ended up just going to the club because they had no gas to heat their homes.
Right.
So they went to the clubs, which they knew were lighted and heated. And because they were there, ended up participating in these sorts of conversations and debates or whatever, and became kind of radicalized as a result.
It always reminds me of like organizations that do community like food giving out food
Mhm.
and stuff. It's like I know part of you is thinking like we'll spread this message, but also part of me thinks that like if people are there to eat, they're not going to be as receptive to a message in that same sense. It is interesting though, the idea that like some people just were there because they had to be, like they felt they not needed to be, but that was the best option to get heat.
Yeah, well, I mean, food outreach as an example, I think it's a laudatory thing to do to feed people that need fed.
Sure.
And so there's service-minded people would be interested in doing that, and they should be because it's a service to other people.
Yeah.
That's in their benefit. But it's not, I think, going to do a whole lot in terms of outreach or in terms of like spreading the message of what the organization is trying to do. Because the people that are there to eat are there from a position of desperation or a
Right.
position of need.
Yeah.
And they will certainly be thankful to the organization, but a meal is not a solution to the problem that has left them hungry.
Right.
And so they are still going to be caught up in trying to maintain their own subsistence, trying to subsist their own existence, And so like, they're not going to be like, thank you for giving me dinner. When's your next organizational meeting so I can come try to help out? Maybe in years down the road, if they are able to find some sort of stability in their lives, they would then decide that that's a way that they could pay it forward, give back to an organization that helped them. But I don't see that as being a particularly strong outreach method to grow an organization.
I don't either. I'm just thinking it's like if we were going to use the example of these like red clubs as a way of fostering organization, like what would that modern parallel be? Because I think, as we've just said, the online space is not one that's sufficient.
I would agree with that. And, I've fucked around on a couple of Discords in, like groups that are trying to organize around political ideology. And the difference is that I don't know any of those people.
Right.
I have no strong connection. I have no literal connection to any of them. And perhaps this is good in a revolutionary sense. I don't know who they are.
Yeah.
I don't know where they live.
There is like some sense there, but also it's like, am I expecting meaningful work from Lenin is cool 1995? Trotsky lives 1917.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's tough, and also they could be fucking feds.
They probably are.
Not that the physical space negates that fact.
Certainly. I mean,
God.
Or even not even feds, but being like fucking turned by feds. William O'Neill's a good example of that.
That's the shittiest thing. It's like there's so many things working against every traditional and novel form of organization. It's like, how do you beat those odds? Like how do you beat how do you beat feds? Like that's so shit.
Yeah.
If there's going to be someone in the group, and the thing is like, I know for a fact that the federal government is not afraid to break the law in order to string you up for it, like think of all the fucking 19, 20-year-old kids that get like honeypotted by federal agents into doing what's a terrorist act, but it's completely organized by the contact,
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many examples of just federal agents playing dirty. It's so shit.
Yeah.
And I know there's no limit to their fucking depravity. I mean, Great Britain is a deeply diseased place nonetheless, but like the federal agents in Great Britain that had kids with their infiltrated groups, they like had long-term relationships and they ended up being double agents. And that's so crazy. It's like, I don't even want to get into the idea of like loving somebody. And then it's like, no, for the last 15 years, I was actually infiltrating your leftist group. Who gets custody?
Jesus.
Yeah.
I didn't know about that. That's fucked.
Oh, it's terribly fucked. True Anon, I think, has a couple of good episodes about it where they actually interview one of the guys that was in not one of the cops.
Mm-hmm.
He was in like a leftist group or an anarchist group. I think he was, an anarchist group is a leftist group. Whatever. I don't care. I don't give a fuck about these labels. To say something about that, there is an interesting in the book. I think that he hints towards the idea of synthesis between all of these ideas being possible. Given enough time,
Mm-hmm.
he's saying that like all these diverse ideas could come together into something that was workable. I think that actually gave me a lot of hope there, because I kept rolling my eyes at every Proudhonist action in this book. I was like, you fucking idiots, like, you absolute morons, like, just get with the vanguard, it's time. But I think there's something to be said about, like, the pull of that force being constructive to the society as a whole. As much as I would like to say, oh, they should have just had, like, Blanky in charge and done the revolution that way and had the Vanguard Party and all that. It's interesting because the form that the society takes is important because it leads to what comes next. So I think that having the idea of synthesis between the ideas is one that's exciting to me. That's all I'm trying to say there.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're going to have any sort of truly democratic organization, you're going to see a kind of push and pull around the different ideas that exist within that organization, and it should be stronger because of it. Not to argue for some sort of moderation or centrism or something like that. That's not what I mean. But the idea that you have different people coming with different ideas about how to move forward should create a stronger step, like eventually, coming from it. I think I would agree that I think if the Blanquists or the Jacobins were left to do it on their own, I think it would have looked a lot different than it did. Yeah. Having the Proudhonists' input there certainly shaped it in a way that I think ultimately was productive.
Mm-hmm. Even though
a lot of their takes individually were fucking stupid.
Yeah. No, I would agree there. I think at the end of the day, regardless that the Commune, from reading this book at least, you could say that the Commune was definitely like a worker government.
Yeah.
It was definitely a people's government in that sense. I don't think anyone is arguing that the Central Committee was like this authoritarian centralization. I mean, it was a council at the end of the day. They didn't have a leader, even though Gluckstein says that might have been a bit of an issue.
Yeah, well, because that created some semblance of indecisiveness, which, or at least slowed down the decision-making process to a point where they weren't able to capitalize on opportunities. Like, one of the things that it's mentioned at the end of the book that is a Marxist criticism of the Commune is that they didn't take Versailles the very next day.
Yeah, which they should have.
Yeah.
I mean, it says in chapter 3 or 4, like, there was a critical fort that was just left untaken for like 2 days.
Yeah.
2 days was all it took. They could have sent troops earlier. It was unguarded.
Mm-hmm.
And like those kind of things alone, I'm not saying it's... Part of me is like, imagine being in a committee and trying to come to that conclusion by consensus. It's like, should we take the fort? Should we not take the fort? Like, that would be so fucked.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be said about the speed of their military action. There's a lot to be desired there. I think they could have acted a lot quicker. But again, rolling my eyes at the Proudhonists, like, they were the people that were like, let's just show them that we're a legal and democratic mandate. Call for legal elections. That'll tell the other government that we're legitimate. They won't come and annihilate us.
Yeah.
They won't come and take back the capital of their country.
Yeah, there is a little bit of that like horse by committee conversation in here. I was trying to find one quote in particular where I wrote that. And it does seem specifically around military action is where the council was slowest to act, in part because perhaps they were trying to be more forgiving than the situation merited. But I get where it comes from, I guess.
Yeah. Well, they certainly didn't expect the kind of just rampant cruelty from the government. I mean, that's something that is abundantly clear, is that this is pre-fascism, but like, you scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. Like, the horrors subjected to the Commune were insane. I mean, I have a quote here in chapter 4 on page 162. Diving deep. 2 things here. First off, after the bloody week, after the week where Paris was retaken, there were still, thousands, millions of people that were part of the Commune.
Yeah.
And so they did tons of executions. They did so many executions that the national press said, enough executions, enough blood, enough victims. And then he gives estimates here. He says estimates range from Duchamp's gross underestimate of 6,500 through Lissagray's 20,000 to 37,000. A fifth of the total were women. A sense of what these figures represent can be gained by comparison to other events, and this is what really shocked me. Far more had died during the last week in May than in any of the other battles during the Franco-Prussian War. The entirety of the war that led up to the Commune, the siege of Paris and the Commune happening, there were less casualties in that entire war than in the week that they took Paris back. Okay, that's insane, right? That kind of bloodshed is crazy. Not only that, any of the Franco-Prussian Wars, in any other massacres in French history, including the terror of the French Revolution. So like that great grand terror, the downfall of Robespierre, I guess, like that whole the bloody turn of the liberty, equality, fraternity, like all of that, still less than just the subjection of cruelty brought on by the national government.
Yep.
Like, I don't know, the bourgeois are not human. Like that's really what I get here. This whole chapter, my heart was in my stomach when I started reading it because I knew what was to come. And even then I was shocked, and I get it. It's 1871. Like the Civil War had just happened, to put it in perspective, the American Civil War, just to give it like a sense of time. But that's why in the beginning I was like, in the beginning of this podcast, I said like, it really wasn't that long ago. Because when I first started thinking about the Paris Commune, I was thinking of it in connection to the French Revolution.
Yeah.
But it's like much more recent than that. It's 80 years after that.
Yeah, almost 100 years, yeah.
Yeah. Just really intense, really brutal stuff. The French people, not the Commune, accurately saw the Commune as like a threat to everything that capitalism stood for. So much to the point where like Germany, who they had just gotten out of a war with, gave them prisoners of war back to France. Bismarck was like, deal with the revolution quickly. That was his only thing he said. He was like, deal with that quickly because it's a threat.
Yeah.
Sorry to get so heated there.
No, but that's true. And I think that's like the whole point of the permanent revolution as well.
Yeah. The imperialist state and the socialist state cannot exist simultaneously without conflict.
Yep.
Yeah. That's just a fact. Even if the socialist state has like the best intentions in mind, I think the conflict will always come from the capitalist side. The existence of socialism is a threat to capitalism, period.
Yeah, exactly. Capitalists will, quote, defend their interests when they see a socialist uprising because they see it means the end of capitalism if it succeeds.
Right. Yeah, I mean, even, to give a non-Trotskyist example, like the fucking Soviet Union, after World War II, Stalin was certainly not expecting, like, the very next day to be enemies with the Western powers, with the Allies, with his former allies.
Yeah.
Yalta had happened, and he was like, oh, now we can go do development, construction, cooperation.
Nope.
No, Britain and the U.S. were already planning to stab him in the back.
Maybe we can come back to talking a little bit about the Commune's achievements.
Yes. Sorry, I got way derailed there.
Well, one thing that I found really interesting and I had absolutely no idea about in any other writing that I'd seen about the Commune was the Commune and women's liberation. There's this whole section here that tells us that working class women played a central role in the Commune from the revolution of March 18th through the final battle that happened. And we got a quote from one of the newspapers in the area that reads, I have seen 3 revolutions and never have women been involved with such determination. It seems that they see this revolution as precisely their own, and in defending it, they defend their own future. I just thought it was really dope to find out, especially given the context of, it's 1871, that women played such a central role, and the Commune, for its faults, as we'll get to, I suppose, was seen by the women's liberation movement as a means to their own liberation. Yeah. So they recognized the connection between women's liberation and class liberation, the proletarian liberation. Yeah,
women kicked ass here. I mean, they threw Molotovs, before they were called Molotovs. That was sick. I love there's just a lot of Molotov cocktail usage in this story, but also I love that they like threw themselves on the cannons and things, and the soldiers were like, we can't shoot these women. They really were an incredible part of it. I mean, not only that, but in the administration of Paris as well. I mean, the women's union plays a significant role. And I think that's really telling.
There is some really interesting stuff. And on page 23, talking about the women's union, we get this little excerpt from something from the women's union that reads, in the old social order, women's work was the most exploited. In the current situation, a terrible and rising poverty due to the collapse of employment opportunities, it is to be feared that the women of Paris, who have been revolutionized for a time, will return to the passive or more or less reactionary state that the old order created for them due to continual privation.
Yeah.
And so they offer a series of reforms that they brought to the Commune as something that they hope to see come to light. And again, I just love the organization happening there with the Women's Union and the revolutionary, like their intention to see through and actually enact in a revolutionary way the promise of the Commune.
Yeah.
I just thought that was dope.
It's really telling to me that the Women's Union held such a prominent stance. Like, they were really key to the whole shebang, pretty much. Even though, but...
Yeah, there is an asterisk to go along with that. But despite the fact that that asterisk exists, I still just think it's really dope. And I appreciate its inclusion in this book for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some central figures to the Commune that are women. I mean, that's, Leo, I guess, is one of them. I really love in the back,
Michelle.
in the index, you can see all the pictures. They have the grid of all the leaders.
Oh, yeah, right here.
Yeah. Very cool stuff. They were photographed. That's how recent this was. Right.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Blanco was a boss, dude.
Dude. Yeah. Okay, so just to talk about the Glucksteists.
Yeah.
In State and Revolution, if I'm not mistaken, he's talking about a vulgarization, like the Gluckstein Party. It was like a fault of the Gluckstein Party. He was saying all these different flavors of socialism, this and that. There was some kind of issue that happened there, and I just can't remember what the hell it was. But I really think that, as I was saying earlier, like there is a direct parallel from the Gluckstein Party to like the idea of the Leninist vanguard party. For one, they were tightly organized intellectuals, essentially, but there were only 800 of them. They were a very small party.
Mm-hmm.
However, like their influence in the Commune it can't be overstated, I think. It's really, I mean, they were such a significant part of the Commune and its organization and its direction in all aspects.
Yeah, and kind of talking about that push and pull when you were talking about the Proudhonists, certainly the Glucksteists were a big part of that, kind of the push, I guess, part of that.
Yeah.
Trying to get them toward more revolutionary, specifically like military action.
Yeah. One thing this book made me think about a lot was the history of socialism outside of communism. I mean, we have had a really Russian-specific lens, like obviously a Marxist lens. But one thing that Donny says in this book is that there were only...
It's just because it's not Donald, right? Because his name is Donny. It makes you feel like uber personal with this person you've never met.
It's not even like Donny IE, I think would be more, but it's Donny with a Y, like it's your kid brother or something. Anyway, Donny, I'm sorry. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. One thing that Donny says is that only two people there were like orthodox Marxists. They were like Marxists in the sense, even at the time, though, Marx was still alive. But one thing that was interesting to me is that all of the representatives of the International Working Men's Association were the Proudhonists. Like they were the party which I thought would be the least connected to that world,
Yeah, it is interesting how intersecting all of those different leftist groups were in the Commune,
Yes.
It's in the interpretation section where it's talking specifically around Trotsky's interpretation, looking back on the Paris Commune.
Okay.
And Trotsky's assertion is that basically because the Bolsheviks were able to create some sort of like majority against the Tsar in Russia, they were able to use that kind of majority power to move the revolution forward in a way that was more centralized and had a clearer party line. So it is suggested by Donny on 187 that Trotsky believes that the presence of the Bolshevik Party within the Soviets was crucial to the success of the October Revolution and part of what set it apart from the Paris Commune.
Yeah, I see that. It also a little further down, it says, thus the party helped overcome the, quote, weak side of an inexperienced direct mass democracy and made operative the strong side. It kind of, just to get back to what Trotsky was saying, it's like the peasantry and the people, like the party has to be there to lead that inexperienced mass. And the same thing in the Commune, where that there's like that inexperienced mass, maybe like the Proudhonist was the popular party, but they really needed a figure. just a curse of history, man, that Blanqui is arrested like the day before.
The day before, yeah.
The day before.
Yeah.
Damn, dude. He could have been Lenin before Lenin. Like,
he definitely seems to have had the zeal, you know?
Yeah.
He had the spark. And
well, maybe he's more like a Trotsky figure, honestly, because he had tried to do the revolution before and was arrested. Like,
Yeah.
that's a direct parallel to what Trotsky did in 1905.
yeah, well, it seems that what happened in the my understanding based on this book is that effectively he was too revolutionary and not organized enough. And so he was like, it's time for the revolution.
Let's do it.
And just jumped the gun without getting enough public support, to the point where the armed militia that was intending to do the revolution actually did take part of the city, but the members of the city that were there were just kind of looking around like, what the fuck is this? What is going on?
I love that, dude. Oh my God. I was just reading that this morning where he was saying, like, you know, they burst out onto the street and everyone was looking at them like they were strangers.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, you need to be recognized by the people. Otherwise, you're just madmen with guns.
Exactly.
Yeah. My God.
Yeah. Again, one of my primary lessons that I've taken from reading this book and lesson from the Paris Commune is that, like, striking that balance between revolutionary will and organization, you know?
Yes. And this is unfortunately where it led to in my mind, because the big question I had was, how do you win the revolution? Right. And the problem is that it's not a problem. First off, that kind of language I think is already cutting it, but you have to be with the people. Like, you have to have the support of the people, you know? And if the idea is like you're going to spark a revolution and then win against a government that is like this immense force against you, how do you do that? And I'm sorry to say that the answer is probably lies with Mao. You know what I mean? Like that's why the idea of protracted people's war is there, is because, like, how do you win that revolution with a force that, in terms of size, would be guerrillas, essentially? It's like with guerrilla warfare, you know? And so if we're talking about like where we're going in the future from here, that's really the big question in my mind, is like, how do you do a revolution and then succeed? You know?
I think that's a legitimate question. A significant concern of anyone that is interested in seeing any sort of revolutionary action happen is, how do you, as a person with revolutionary will, revolutionary intention, make that clear to the mass of people in a way that wins support and doesn't automatically get you labeled as a terrorist or something like that, like a Guy Fawkes or something like that? Because Blanqui got arrested and then missed the revolution because he was a day early. Yeah. You know?
It's really funny to see like late stage capitalism become a popularized term, because so many people know that like we're in the end of capitalism. Like we're
past the tipping point.
Yeah, we're at the stretched limit. Yeah. Like, it's all downhill from here, you know? At what point is that convertible into like a mass movement? You know, at what point do enough people saying that becomes actionable?
Well, I wonder if that just comes from political consciousness. Like, I think, at least in the West, in the United States, every person I know is disillusioned with the government. Yeah. Every person I know recognizes that the government is not their friend and shouldn't be trusted. But not every person I know believes that they have any capability of doing anything about it. You know what I mean? Like, they've been so beaten down and downtrodden that they don't believe that there is a strength within the people that could do anything about it. Yeah. So they recognize the symptoms, but feel helpless to live them out.
Yeah. I don't know. How do you inspire that kind of thing? If we're going to take the argument of like the vanguard party, actually, there's a great quote on page 66 where he says, there can be no doubt of Blanqui's dedication to the cause of workers' liberation. While he welcomed strikes, he doubted the revolution could come through workers' self-activity because, quote, the great majority were mired in ignorance. So the action of an educated minority would be required. There's no durable revolution without light. Liberty means instruction. Equality means instruction. Fraternity means instruction. Teachers, books, the printing press, these are true revolutionary agencies. It's such a parallel to like the idea of the vanguard party, you know, and I think it's even funny where he's like the printing press, the newspaper, like those are revolutionary ideas, because I think that that's a big disconnect in the modern leftist space, where it's like how much educational work needs to be done. I'm sure everyone agrees that class consciousness needs to be cultivated, but I think that people are quick to thumb their nose at like the joke about Trotskyists is that they always start a newspaper.
Mhm.
You know, they always start a blog or whatever. And all of the fucking books that we have gotten have been from Trotskyist publishers, okay? But it's like there is something to be said about the fact that like that kind of distribution of knowledge, like that kind of instruction is inherently revolutionary.
Sure.
So why are people so quick to laugh at that? Because they think it's helpless? Maybe it's because nobody fucking reads? Like, I don't know. What's the deal?
Yeah, I think we're distracted. I think, like I said in the last episode, I am so politically disillusioned that I have two options. I can pursue projects like this where I'm trying to pursue self-education, radical self-education, or I can play Skyrim for the 50th time and play the exact same build in Argonian Rogue.
There you go.
and just do that because it helps me get through the hours of the day. You know what I mean? So I think we're just, so many people laugh off the idea of doing anything revolutionary, like participating in organization, trying to do any sort of radical self-education or anything like that because they feel helpless to it or feel that it is a pointless endeavor and instead just find themselves more deeply mired in the distractions that are produced by capital in order to perpetuate it. That's maybe a pretty cynical take.
I was feeling dreadful there. I was like, damn, we're fucked. I hate to say like you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, you know, but there comes a point even where I think that proselytizing will be it's more of a factor for rejection than anything, you know.
Well, I think we can both speak to this as educators, as people that have existed in the space of like public education.
Right.
You have to seek to be educated for education to be meaningful.
Yeah.
And so therein lies the problem, is that there are things like this book or any of the books that we've read so far that are around for people that are interested in learning about revolutionary ideas. And so it is a revolutionary thing. The printing press, like he says, those are revolutionary tools and they can be used by people who seek to use them.
Yeah.
But it requires a drive on the part of the person. You can't force someone to read a revolutionary idea or be taken by it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The impetus is on the seeker. That's a weird way to say that.
Yeah. I don't know. Is there anything else you want to say about the achievements of the commune? That's the topic
really
we were
like
talking about.
Haven't spoken a lot about its achievements.
Haven't. Well, the thing is that it's weird because, and I felt this way because like I know that there are achievements, so to say, but they're all things that we kind of take for granted as communists, you know, like they created a bottom-up organization.
Mhm.
I think the nice thing about the commune is that they're a direct example of a council republic. You know, they were democratically elected representatives from below that created councils. And that's the hierarchy that was created there. I mean, like, that's how they organized. And one really nice thing is that think of a city like Paris. I mean, it's not small by any means. I don't know where, I didn't mark where the quote was, but he talks about the comparison of Paris as a city to any other city in France, to many of the capitals across Europe. I mean, it is a massive city. And at first thought, you might think that if all of the administrators of the city flee, which is what happens here, that it would crumble. It would become anarchy in like the not cool sense, in like the bad sense. And then, but it's immediate that idea is immediately destroyed by the fact that the workers just do it. They don't need bureaucrats to do what they have been doing consistently. I mean, and the city keeps running. The city keeps thriving.
Mhm.
Like, these working people are quick to organize themselves. In fact, I did have a quote on page 18. I like this quote because it's not just like this spontaneous construction of workers' organization. It's that kind of like hammering out the line to the point where you're getting what you want. But he says here, let's call the owners and the workers together and say to the former, here are the demands that the workers have formulated. Discuss them, and if your owners don't want to accede to them, if you threaten to shut your establishments down, we will requisition them. We will let the workers run your production after paying fair compensation. That is what should be done. We should not take the decisions ourselves on this.
Mhm.
So, two things. One, it's not from a central authority. The government is saying to the workers, go to your employers, go to your workplaces and make your demands, right? And then you will have our coercive backing. Like normally the script is flipped,
Mhm.
right? The bosses are backed by the government in whatever society, you know. here's how we organize this from the bottom up. And it's not even this idea of like violent expropriation. It's like, here, make your demands, and then you will decide the production there. You know, it's not like seize the means. It's like go with make your unionize.
Request
basically.
the means.
Yeah. But the thing is, like, it's backed with the force of the government, you know, which is the people. So, yeah, I mean, that's an inspiring example, because it's one that I think is more workable than the idea that some people have in their minds of like seizing the means of production, like forcibly, violently doing a revolution and taking. It's like, it doesn't have to be that kind of like snatching action. It's more so like you're already in these workplaces, you're already working these machines, like your bosses. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think I get you. And there was something a little bit further that I was thinking of while you were talking about that, something a little further in the chapter. On page 41, there's this long block quote that came from someone named Mendez.
A bitter enemy of the commune.
Yeah. But like the point here is that even enemies of the commune had to recognize like the strength of the collective will of the people. And I just love this line at the end of this that says, talking about seeing the People's Army all kind of gathered in front of the Hotel de Ville. You know, there's this description of the sharp points of the bayonets glittering in the sun made the place seem like a field of lightning, like it was alive. But the last two lines, then all the sounds merged into a single cheer, the universal voice of the countless multitude, and all these people had but one heart, just as they had but one voice. That's really fucking beautiful. Yeah. But I think like that speaks to your point. We don't have to think of revolution as this sort of inherently, I mean, there's going to be violence, you know what I mean?
Right.
But it doesn't have to be a thing that is like, we've raised the People's Army and we are violently taking over.
Yeah, there's like a front of war and trenches. And it's not necessarily warfare.
It doesn't have to be that fucking hellscape in order to get there. But instead, there is a space where, through the collective action of an organized people, where you could use coercive force in a positive way. Yeah, I would agree that that spoke to me.
I love the way that Mao, you know, the people have stood up. It's not that they are fighting, even though they did do civil war, like that kind of revolution, but like, it's just the idea that the people are making themselves present, clear. They're standing up and being in charge. You know, it's like there's one boss to 50 workers. Just by sheer scale of numbers, like once those people assert their power, there's nothing that can stop it.
Yep.
You know, and that's exactly what I feel here. I mean, it reminds me when Joe Biden got elected in 2020 and everyone was like, yeah, like there were like parades in the street. Like, you know, even, you know, I mean, everyone was happy to see Trump go, and like that kind of collective, like, yeah, like that collective cheer, like you could feel that. That was a palpable feeling, even if it was for fucking Joe Biden. Yeah. But like, that's the thing is like that, you know, that collective power exists.
Yeah. There's something really beautiful in that.
Yeah, I agree. I love the quote at the bottom of that very same page.
Okay.
If you want your children to be men gaining the reward of their labor, not a sort of animal trained for the workshop and for war, fertilizing with its sweat the fortune of an exploiter, or pouring out its blood for a despot. If you want the daughter whom you cannot bring up and watch over as you would to be no longer instruments of pleasure in the arms of the aristocracy or wealth. This quote is longer than I thought. If you want debauch and poverty no longer to drive men to the police and women to prostitution. I love that that's it's
the
like,
implication being that
women
they become cops.
Prostitutes, men become cops. And that's so real, dude.
They're definitely talking about beggars and drunkards, but I love the implication that
all the fail sons become police.
The drunkards that were once caught by the cops then just become the cops.
Yes. If you desire a reign of justice, workers be intelligent, arise. Let your stout hands fling beneath your feet the foul reaction.
Yeah. Such a great fucking quote. What's funny is I highlighted immediately before where you started reading, if you are sick of vegetating in ignorance and squatting in the muck.
Damn, I love vegetating in ignorance sometimes, though. I can't lie.
I'm telling you, I've been playing Skyrim again.
So is Carissa.
I was going to say that just as a quick aside before we jump into any other section, that because this happens throughout, Donny loves to dunk on Stalin, and
He's a trot. He's a trot.
There are a lot of dunks on Stalin in this that I just think are pretty funny. Like on page 40, he says, many people are rightly suspicious of bureaucracy given the terrible legacy of Stalinism, which used the language of socialism and communism, but operated a centralized dictatorship of one man.
Okay, soon we're going to have to read Stalin.
Yeah.
Not necessarily his theory, but there is that. I really want to read that Lacerda book on there about the critique and, defense of a black legend. It might be, I'm not 100% because I think it might be a tough read without like historical context.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard it's not like a biography, but more so like a critique and defense. And so I don't know, but I really I'm hankering for some apologia. You know?
I'm interested to know why MLMs are so, sympathetic to Stalin. So
because he's our boy, man. What the fuck do you mean? Like, it's clear, how many, like, it's the, no, sorry, my tone is so dismissive there. But I love, like the black and white faces on the red background of like Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao. It's how many heads can we put in that? Like, I need a collage with like every possible leftist leader. That's going to be my fucking syncretic leftist ideology where I'm just like unionism. But no, not unionism like a trade union, but it's like every leftist thought, like give it all to me. I'm just going to synthesize all of it. Yes.
There will be many hyphens in the description of your ideology.
I was just imagining like Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao, Stalin, Gonzalo, fucking Ronald McDonald. I don't know. Give it all to me.
I don't know how much you want to talk about the People's Army or whatever they called it, the National Guard.
I think that the structure of the National Guard being the basis of formation for the Commune is something that's really interesting. But I don't know what else there is to say about that.
It just kept coming up in my mind because it obviously played such a pivotal role, like you already said, and the idea that there was a mass of people that could defend the city or could, militarily speaking, like do something to take the city. Yeah. Is an important part of the revolution. And obviously, like even Lenin writes pretty heavily in State and Revolution about the armed masses. And so I do think that there's something there that is worth reckoning with, thinking about, the Socialist Rifle Association and stuff like that.
I 100% agree. We were struggling with the idea of creating a people's militia, like an armed mass of people after the revolution. Maybe the solution is to create it before.
Yeah.
Maybe the idea is to get an armed people in practice, and then that will create the conditions for revolution.
Yeah, and it also, maybe this undermines your point, but when the mass of workers go to their boss and make their demands, those demands may be more readily heard when they know they are coming from an armed militia.
Yeah, I know. I think that's totally fair. I mean, it's part and parcel. I mean, it's part of that mass power. Not only are the numbers there, but they're also armed. Like, that's part of the coercion. That's really the main thing there. I was thinking about Lenin, too, because I was like, forget creating an armed militia afterwards. Just like the idea that they had it before. That's a big part of the feminist critique, though. There weren't women in the militia. It's like they were seen as the wives of the militiamen. There is that distinction, like that sexist distinction is still there. And I think that does play into it a lot because the political form came from what came before. What was there before? Like the National Guard organization was the basis of organization. And so if that organization doesn't include women, then the new construction will fundamentally not include women. So that's kind of my problem with the structure of having the militia beforehand, is that it wasn't inclusive. We need women with guns.
To take another direction with talking about the National Guard, the other thing that stood out to me that I guess was probably self-evident to many people, but I'm a dummy. So reading this book, the idea that, quote, National Guard, the National Guard, or any sort of, military institution is inherently something that's designed to operate as a mechanism of the state, a coercive hand of the state, the coercive hand of the state. And having a National Guard that is made up of the people, a people's militia, is inherently a horizontal hierarchy as opposed to one that's vertical.
Yeah. Well, I think that the militia in this case is specific, because it was organized in relation to the siege, and part of that organizational structure is that it wasn't top down. Like, that's part of the reason that the organization was so able to be formed into the commune is that it was organized from the bottom up by default. But part of that is just the conditions of the war, like the aristocracy, like the bureaucracy, had fled, and so they had to organize it themselves, and they did that bottom up. So I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I was just trying to say that it was restructuring in my mind, like this idea that part of what made me uncomfortable, I guess, in the past about a people's militia is the idea of using coercive, violent force. Yeah. Because as I said last time, I'm a reformed pacifist, and so I didn't like the idea of, like, we don't like the state military subjugating us, so we're going to create our own military to subjugate
others.
And it just seemed contradictory to me. But it's like very clearly there's a distinction between a top-down kind of situation and a horizontal or a bottom-up, I guess. Situation.
We're not just shooting them with the people's gun. That's such a frequent thing that I'll see online is that anarchists are like, if you just change the name, it doesn't change anything. And it's like, we're not just changing the name. The idea is to change the organizational structure.
Yeah, it's fundamentally different.
Yeah. This is the people's taser, like.
But still obviously necessary. Again, I mean, Bloody Week being a pretty clear indication of like how necessary it is to have some sort of military force and to stand guard. Yeah,
the reaction of the bourgeois is inevitable. And it's naive to think otherwise. It was naive then, it's naive now.
Yeah.
And I mean, history only shows, my God, not to keep referencing the Jakarta method, but like, I really, really love the part in Jakarta method where he's talking to all of these old revolutionaries and he's like, what do you think of it now looking back into it? And they're all like, the Maoists were right to do insurgency. Like, they were right to arm themselves, And it's like, we keep being so naive. One thing is interesting is the kind of the conditions in Paris, how they were saying, I actually pulled a quote for it about the different form of the working class, because there was some analysis that would say that since they weren't in like factory settings, that the revolution wouldn't be as possible. But one thing that's interesting is that even being like artisans and craftsmen, they were still able to be organized into that same kind of like trade union structure.
Yeah.
That local workshop structure. And I have a quote. At the base of everything, in the smallest, most artisanal enterprise, was the absolutely irreducible and ingrained antagonism between boss and wage earner, between exploiter and exploited. Then, as now, small employers struggling to survive in competition with larger rivals often treated their employers harshly, and since it was more difficult for these latter to organize and resist, feelings of bitterness could be intense. So, I just love the idea of like the petty bourgeois tyrant. It's like the small employer is just as oppressive as the big employer. And in fact, being in competition with these big employers drives them to be more exploitative.
Even more so, yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting analysis that I hadn't really considered before.
Right above that paragraph at the top of 178, he mentions that the existence of a working class does not depend on the size of the workplace or the type of product made. It is determined by social relations, whether or not there is a class of people who have no choice but to work for wages, and in doing so, assist the accumulation of capital by the bosses.
That's where my Post-it note was originally.
Yeah.
Even in modern discourse, like I hate, it's like, oh, baristas aren't proletarian, It's like you're misunderstanding the fact that they're forced to sell their labor for wages. Like, there's no alternate option.
Yeah, I think there's almost an almost romantic idea of a proletarian as some sort of hard laborer.
Yeah, the blue overalls and like the rolled sleeves, smashing the hammer, like, the sparks flying everywhere. It's like, no.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's the nurse at the counter of the hospital, man. Like, it's the person that just made the shamrock in your Guinness. Like, it kind of talks about what Trotsky was talking about when he was saying, like, it's not about what's ripe for development. It's like all countries have the potential for revolution within them. It really just depends on the form. Yeah. And I see that a lot here.
Yeah, for sure. it's there always because the social relationship is there always.
Absolutely.
As an addition, when you had mentioned that you had a quote, you were talking about artisans and trade unions and stuff like that. I was like, oh, I know what quote he's going to pick. And it wasn't this one. So I just want to read it. On page 62, we get this little block quote. I'm not sure where it comes from. I think maybe Proudhon is the one that said it based on the context. But Gluckstein writes, in the old days, an intelligent, honest, and hardworking worker could hope to emancipate himself, and it was not uncommon to see a worker become a master in his turn and then retire with a reasonable pension for his old age. With a few rare exceptions, this is quite impossible today, no matter how good the worker. When old age is reached, this worker will have saved nothing due to the high cost of basic necessities and is forced to end his days begging on the streets for a crust of bread. And it just spoke to me about the kind of changing landscape under capitalism, what retirement even becoming something that isn't possible, even for highly skilled workers like an artisan.
Yeah. Well, I think, it's the concentration of the means of production. And the idea of like taking an apprenticeship, becoming a master is the idea of eventually owning your own means, right? Even the idea of apprenticeships is still around, obviously, but I think that the idea of being like an apprentice and then becoming a master is long gone. It's outside of like crafts.
Do you want to take time to specifically talk about the Proudhon versus Blanqui versus Jacobin kind of positions, or do you think we have anything to say about that?
I think we kind of covered the idea, the broad strokes, The more I learn about Proudhon, the more I'm like, you're a dumbass. It seems naive, not operating within the realm of reality, just kind of this vibes-based approach.
Yeah, vibes-based. I think he's very idealistic, and even Gluckstein kind of sends shots at him a couple of times. I lolled at a point where he says Proudhon's approach was to focus on economics alone. Alas, in real life, the state will not allow itself to be overlooked. So whenever faced with serious political issues, Proudhon was unprepared. I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah, my big point for like the Proudhonist idea versus the Blanquist idea was probably on page 124. The block quote at the bottom. Sorry, the Commune's immediate mission was to organize the inevitable war against the upstarts and conspirators of Versailles. In the end, the reality of the situation could not be ignored. Following the example of the Germans, Thiers had formed an army destined to lay siege to Paris. The choice was either to resign oneself to this and beg for mercy or to fight. There were no other choices. A communal revolution could have been the fruit of victory, but of all else, victory was still to be won. It's the action that's there. And this is the analysis that both Marx and Lenin have, but like their inaction, even brief, was enough to doom them. A quote that I had picked out, just how finely balanced the situation was, is revealed by Thiers' administration. Quote, if we had to detach 15 or 20,000 men from the army of Versailles to contain Lyon, Marseille, Toulouse,
probably,
and Bordeaux, we would never have gotten into Paris. And like, that's crazy. They were this close. Something that Donny talks about is the fact that the other communes that spring up were primarily sympathetic. They didn't have the same organizational structure. And that hurt my heart a little bit. But I think there is something to be said about a sympathetic commune popping up. The full idea of social change wasn't necessarily required for the conditions for the change of the social reality to happen. What they're saying here is that if those had been just one step more, like if those communes had been just maybe one more step up, or the central commune, the Paris commune, had taken more action to create more of like a dissolved or separate national response from the French national government, they could have won. I mean, that's really something. And to hear it from the administration of the people who won in the end is really incredible to me. I mean, that like struck my soul.
Yeah. Yeah. Just for them to admit how close they were to defeat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know I was all over the place there, but again, the communes that sprung up and supported the Paris Commune sprung up whether or not they were intent on making socialist construction their goal. Like the potential for sea change was there, whether the conditions for like socialist change were there or not in those other places. I think that even says something about like the vanguard party. It's like Paris was a vanguard city in that sense.
Or the permanent revolution, like meaning one revolution inspiring revolutions elsewhere. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Really, really something there. And so that's why I'm so like anti-Proudhon right now, because they were really, again, they took power and they were like, let's call for immediate elections to show that we're legal. What? You just did a revolution. What do you mean? Like,
yeah. While I do think Gluckstein affords leniency to communists that he doesn't afford to anarchists, I do think Proudhon, at least as framed here, often can't see his nose despite his face. You know what I mean? Like he's so focused on big picture stuff that he doesn't see how the things immediately in front of him are paving the way away from what his ultimate goal is. Yeah. You know what I mean? His immediate decisions or immediate like attitudes are ultimately, because they're being framed by what he wants it to be, this like big picture pie in the sky kind of thing. Because his immediate decisions are being framed by that, he's making bad calls, weak takes in the moment that also actively work against moving toward the thing that he wanted to get to in the first place.
Yeah. It just feels like the Lenin distinction, between like the abolition of the state versus the withering of the state, like they're concerned with like the immediate abolition of the state and the creation of this future ideal. Whereas maybe the Blanquist position here is, seize the power, use the power, and then like the change will come. The change will be there. Because like the basis of that social change was already happening in Paris, but the problem is that they got annihilated.
Yeah, and I'd mentioned in previous episodes that I didn't understand why anarchists and communists don't get along, and how so much of the narrative around the Paris Commune that comes from communists is so adamantly anti-anarchists. And I think reading this contextualizes a little bit for me, because Proudhon, he just had so many fucking weak takes, man. And I could see how he would be viewed as a hindrance to progress as opposed to an ally in it.
Yeah.
The situation of the Commune was one that I think was wrought from the beginning, in part because they had to make decisions about, do they focus on forward progress of the Commune, or do they focus on defense against opposition to the Commune? And I think that question and that balance is what ultimately led to the kind of indecision of the council and the downfall of the Commune.
It's interesting to think about like the 4 different stages of the Commune, the 4 different governments that he talks about here, where he's saying like the initial stage of the Commune with the council at the Hotel de Ville only lasted a handful of days before suddenly they had to create a committee for public safety. One thing we didn't talk about when we were talking about the organization of the National Guard is the fact that ultimately, even though it became kind of like an opposing forces issue where the council and the Central Committee were at odds, right? And even though the Central Committee had given up power to the council, they were still like there was conflict there. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's kind of an issue as well, because if we're talking about creating an armed mass like a people's militia, how can that mass still be like, how it still needs to be directed? It still needs to be directable. But you can see here, like in the Paris Commune, where that separation of powers became an issue because the council ultimately tried to dissolve the Central Committee, and to which they said, eat shit. And I mean, it's like this is the kind of disorganization that needs to be quelled, especially during the middle of a siege, essentially, of a civil war. I mean, it's another point of disorganization that led to the downfall of the Commune.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thought experiment to wonder what would have been had they not had to expel so much energy in the defense of imperialists or capitalists coming in and trying to stop it from happening.
Yeah, that's a classical example.
There is a quote here on 111. He says, "How can the desire to advance toward human liberation be balanced against the need to confront the enemy of that goal?" And I think that's a central question of any revolutionary action.
Yeah, exactly what I was going to say. It's just, it takes place time and time again. My thought is always with the Soviet Union being bankrupt on spending for defense. Like we can spend on defense because, the military industrial complex is like a part of the core engine of American society, but forcing the Soviets to do the same when their fundamental goal was to create a socialist state, I think really fucked them over in the end of the day. It was part of the reason of their downfall is that they had to spend so much money on defense, even though that defense never happened. They were never attacked, even though they were certainly attacked and under siege constantly.
And undermined.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, it's that kind of parallel is, I guess, in every single communist. That should be the question on every communist mind, you know?
Yeah, and I think that also kind of brings to light or brings to bear the kind of conflict between the different factions within the Commune as well.
Mhm.
You know, the Proudhonists and the Blanquists. There's this block quote here. Hardly had we met and began to function than we noticed an important fact that these words Paris Commune were understood in two different ways by two different members of the council. For one side, the Paris Commune expressed and personified the first application of the anti-governmental principle. It meant war on the old conceptions of the unitary state and despotic centralism. The Commune for them represented both the triumph of the principle of the autonomy of groups freely federated and the most direct government possible of the people and by the people. For the others, the Paris Commune was, on the contrary, the continuation of the old Paris Commune of 1793. It represented, in their eyes, a dictatorship in the name of the people, an enormous concentration of power. Maybe that's not a direct correlation to what we were talking about here, but this idea that, like, when you are trying to balance two kind of diametrically opposed goals, then it becomes very difficult to move forward in any revolutionary way even when something like the Commune has been achieved, you know?
Yeah. What's interesting is the way that he says the second group is influenced by the original revolution, because that's something that Donny Gluckstein says a lot in here, is that there was a contingent of the Commune that thought of it as an extension, like a completion of the original French Revolution, you know? And I think, like, while that original notion of, like, liberté, égalité, fraternity is the ultimate goal of the Commune, I think that kind of mired a couple of the forces in the Commune. It maybe was more of a barricade, not to no pun intended, but to their ultimate development. Yeah, he talks about this in the critiques. Some people say that the goal of the Commune was just like a municipal government; it wasn't like a socialist action.
Yeah,
I think that it's pretty clear here that their goal was to change the mechanisms of power and the organization in society.
Yeah, agreed. I just wrote, to sum it all up here, like this idea of trying to balance oppositional ideas about how to move forward and or balancing the desire to move forward with the desire to defend oneself against those trying to stop you from moving forward. He mentions here, this is, I guess, specifically about like the ideological differences among the groups that formed the Commune, you know, the Jacobins, the Blanquists, and the Proudhonists. The Jacobins and Blanquists understood the absolute need to physically maintain the power gained in the March 18 revolution. All hopes of social transformation depended on this. The Proudhonists and Socialists understood that the revolution, compared, say, to the debacle of the failed La Villette Rising of August 1870, relied on the active involvement of the mass of Parisian workers inspired by a vision of a new society. No dictatorship or committee could substitute for them. The difficulty was how to combine these two insights.
Yeah, it's exactly that synthesis that, you know, we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
It's like, because at the end of the day, ultimately, like, that synthesis is what was required, you know? They can't have that kind of, like, organizational structure without the mass movement, you know, and they can't have the mass movement without the organizational structure. It's exactly in the middle. Like, that's the, God, fuck. It's like, I don't want to be like, you gotta be a centrist, but it's in between two poles. It's not the maximum program or the minimum program. It's somewhere in between. You know, the optimal tempo. We're going to become fucking Trotskyists. God damn it.
It's happening. Yeah. I can feel it.
But that just rings so true to me, because it's like, you cannot be too far in either direction in this sense. Even if I am like for, you know, immediate action in the sense of the Paris Commune, like the immediate march on Versailles, even if they were to take that action, it would be fruitless without the popular support.
Yeah, I don't even know that I would frame it in the sense of saying like it's a polarity. I would just frame it in the sense of like tunnel vision. You can't be so hyper-focused on one thing that you negate or ignore the other. Right. And that you somehow have to find a way to balance. Makes it sound like a centrist position. But like you
that's my dilemma.
You somehow have to find a way to like address both needs.
Yeah. The home front, freedom versus authority, is a huge point, because they're talking about tamping down those individual liberties,
Yeah.
or maybe like the liberties of like the free press, of like that democraticness, because it was required, you know?
Modern neoliberals like the 19th century forebears throw the words freedom and liberty around like confetti.
Yeah, you know, exactly. I mean, to talk about the continuation of the original revolution, it's like those terms, liberty, equality, fraternity, those three, they're fruitless without they're empty ultimately without like the actual social change here. And I think that that's exactly the same thing that he's talking about with modern neoliberals there. But the thing is, yeah, it says it right here. The revolution had to be protected from the Versailles counterattack, but how far could the commune constrain its enemies without interfering with the very liberties it stood for? The problem emerged early on in discussions whether to publish the council's minutes. It's like clearly that transparency needs. I know, dude, we're always laughing about the minutes. But like that need for transparency is clear if you want like a democratic society with participation, like a direct democratic participatory society. Like that kind of transparency is something that is key and crucial. But the problem is that it's like operational security, you know, it's like they can't publish the minutes because that would give their plans up essentially.
Yeah, it gives away the game. But it's also an important part of the kind of always revocable aspect of anyone that's been put into a position of authority, you know, decision-making in the commune. The idea is that they need to be, those positions are revocable at any given moment, but you only are truly making them revocable at any given moment when every element of the work of that work is transparent to the populace.
Yeah, there can't be anything in the shadows, otherwise how can the public make their decision appropriately?
An informed decision.
Yeah, in the way we want, you know. I think he was fucking up in those minutes, dude. No, I mean, but I don't know. Donny he says it kind of somewhere in here. I can't find the quote where he's like, the real answer is somewhere in between. Imagine that. It's like they could have just published some of the minutes, you know? But that's one thing there. But on top of that, you know, he talks about like freedom of the press.
Yeah. Of course, the Blanquist view. The commune is at this moment not a parliamentary chamber. It is a council of war. In the armed struggle, how could we let the enemy into a council of war?
Yeah.
I fucking love this guy. I didn't know anything about him. August.
But he was a hard ass hitter. Like he was a cool motherfucker.
Dude, I had no fucking clue who he was. And then when he first gets mentioned, I was like, this is my kind of dude. His little fucking phrase, atheism, communism, and revolution. I'm like, this guy's coming after me.
Yeah, I love the counterblast from Delis Clues to talk about banning papers. He's like, we're criticized for banning papers, but we are at war. It's like so obvious.
Yeah.
Yeah, under capitalism, free speech is largely a myth. Before 1871, capitalists had voiced no objection when left-wing papers were banned. Today, when free speech formally exists, wealthy capitalists like Murdoch control the media. So exactly what you're talking about earlier. It's like that media control is definitely part of the levers of power.
Mm-hmm.
I know that we have an ideal society in mind, but we're putting the cart before the horse when we put those ideals before like our self-existence, our right to exist, our defense.
Yeah, I just think rational, reasonable people would acknowledge that there are enemies to this project that we're working on. And so having insight into everything we're doing is beneficial to the enemy and harmful to us.
Yeah.
So even though it is not exactly the most transparent, most, you know, openly democratic way to conduct what's happening here, so to speak, I think everyone would acknowledge that's a reasonable conceit in the short term.
Yeah. I absolutely agree.
It's just fucking silly. This is what I was talking about with Proudhon and his like weak takes, right? Where he gets so caught up in the pie in the sky ideology that he doesn't see how he's shooting himself in the fucking foot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying too. We're on the same page here.
I am sympathetic to anarchism. Mm-hmm. I want to see positive representations of anarchism in the works that we're reading.
Yeah.
And it's a fucking bummer that Proudhon's not as based as you would want him to be.
It's based, man. Based on what? No, I agree. This is going to sound so smarmy, but like in the historical record, man, they really fucking show their ass constantly. You know, a lot, quite frequently, at least in what we've read at the very least.
I mean, so far, yeah.
You know,
and granted, we are reading everything from a pretty communist bent.
Yeah.
Everything's coming from a definite Leninist side.
Although I will, this is just completely tangential, but like when I was reading Homage to Catalonia, the anarchists are shown really favorably, and it's mostly because George Orwell hated Stalin.
Yeah. Orwell was a staunch anti-communist.
He was a socialist, but he hated Stalin. That was really it. But he was a dickhead anyway.
Yeah, he was a fucking asshole.
Yeah, I would not consider him to be like a leftist figure. That's definitely not what I'm saying here.
Yeah, no, wasn't he a part of the colonial police?
He was. Yeah, he has a whole book about where he had to kill an elephant, I think it was, and he was like the natives. But he did go and fight in international brigades in the Spanish Civil War. I will give him that, on the side of the communists. In fact, on the side of the anarchists. Mm-hmm. But he also, ratted out his figures to the government.
Yeah, I know he was a fucking rat. I know that.
He was a fucking rat. Fuck George Orwell, man. I don't care about that guy. What were we talking about? Anarchists, they keep showing their ass in history. Let's get some anarchist history where they don't, please.
Yes.
Maybe next week.
Recommendations are very welcome. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah, and if you're an anarchist listening to this, please, I want to hear from you. Give us some reading. Give us something. Give us something.
Yeah, when we were having a conversation about what we should be reading, I was like, I really want to read some fucking anarchist stuff, man. And the problem is the only anarchist stuff that I really have access to at this point or have read at all is Kropotkin, which,
it's its own thing.
Yeah, we're going to get to for sure. But we just don't even know where to start, Yeah.
I guess
a lot of people would probably say, what is property, right? Which is the Proudhon writing.
Maybe.
Which I'm not feeling heavily motivated to read right now.
The philosophy of poverty or the poverty of philosophy? Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know. Let us know, please. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah. We probably should just jump into the critiques. The final chapter of this book, Interpretations, Critics, and Champions. Gluckstein, our good friend Donny, goes through some of the writing that happened, some of it contemporary. I mean, Marx was in London writing about it at the time.
Yeah.
And then also other criticisms that have come in hindsight, looking back on the Commune. And I think that there are some interesting and important insights here.
I agree.
First of all, I thought it was interesting, and I did not know that Marx described the Commune as a sphinx because its exact meaning was so mysterious. Mm-hmm. I think that that's apt.
Well, there is something really interesting to be said about the spontaneity of the Commune. I mean, the conditions were certainly there. We've talked about that endlessly, but it happened with no leaders, it happened out of the massive organization of the workers, and although the people at the head were ultimately I will say the intellectual class, I suppose, there's something really to be said there about the spontaneous uprising.
Yeah, and the other successful revolutions that I think of, quote, successful revolutions that I think of, have very clear figureheads at the fore. Lenin is an obvious example. Che is another obvious example.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And it's just nice to see an example of a space where it was a kind of more, I mean, maybe this is a bad thing, but a more formless revolution that took hold.
Yeah, I will, there is an admirable quality to it, even if ultimately I think it was part of their downfall.
Yeah, well said. Again, he opens the interpretations here by making that comment about Marx, describing it as the Sphinx, and then says, unfortunately, the communards did not help clarify the issue because they left no single document summing up their aims. The nearest approximation was the official manifesto of April 19. Since an agreed statement was needed, it was voted through.
Yeah.
But all groups found it disappointing, and it was the lowest common denominator.
The lowest common denominator really struck me.
Horse by committee.
Horse by committee. Exactly. I had the exact same thought because they just needed a slogan, basically. Yep. They needed a program, and they were like, nobody really likes this, but we need it.
It's the closest we can all agree to.
That's so shitty. Consensus is a tough thing.
That's why, something like the dictatorship of the proletariat ends up becoming so appealing as an idea and a vanguard party, because then you have a minority leading the people with the people's interest in mind until ultimately you get to a space where consciousness is more widespread and makes it more possible to find consensus. Maybe.
That's so tough. It's not like leading the people. It's not following the people, but it's being part and parcel of that crowd. It's got to, I don't know. That's what I'm thinking of right now.
Well, so talking about criticisms.
Mm-hmm.
First, I would like to talk a little bit about this section, starting on 170, Anarchism, the Commune as the Abolition of Politics.
Yes.
My whole time reading the book, my interpretation of this is that Gluckstein is a socialist, at least, a communist, most likely, and rightfully gives space for communists or other socialists, like Blanqui, to maybe have incomplete views, not see the whole picture, to make missteps, and contextualize those things in a way that acknowledges that they were wrong, but understandably wrong.
Yeah.
I feel like he does not afford anarchism the same room, and it feels unfair and pretty biased toward communism quite often to me. And I think there were a lot of comments in this section that made me feel that way. He does name drop Kropotkin a couple of times, though, and give us a couple of quotes, though, because as I had said before, Proudhon was obviously central in the organization of the Commune and a big part of it. But my take until I got to this section was like, well, that's like looking at Stalin and talking about communism. You know what I mean? You can't take a single figure of a larger movement and presume them to be representative of everyone within that movement. And so maybe it's a little unfair to point the finger at anarchists when really you want to point the finger at Proudhon.
Yeah.
But Kropotkin does come with pretty similar takes, saying that the Commune was a bold, clearly formulated negation of the state, and says also that on page 171, he quotes Kropotkin, who is complaining against the Commune, saying, "Why should we admit the necessity to regulate the mutual relations of the groups which make up each commune? There is no more reason for a government inside the commune than for a government outside." And I agree. I don't know. I guess I just wanted to put it out there that while I agree that I'm not 100% behind Kropotkin on this take, because I think it's dismissive of the material conditions in front of the people in the moment of the commune. Yeah. I also think Gluckstein is maybe doing a little bit of framing here in a way that makes it unfair toward anarchism in general.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there, because ultimately what happened was a result of the material conditions. Like I said, I mean, that structure was already there. It was just kind of utilized via revolution in the National Guard Central Committee. I mean, but it's still a bottom up organization. I'm not exactly even sure what Kropotkin is saying here when he says that. I
think Kropotkin's criticism is coming from the idea that they're creating a centralized power inside of the commune, like with the committee and the way that they organize the municipal workers and stuff like that. I forget what that was called again. But Kropotkin, I think, my interpretation of this quote, again, as it's framed here by Gluckstein, maybe in a way that is intentionally being critical of Kropotkin, is that Kropotkin saying, what's the point of overthrowing the government if you're just going to create a government?
I don't know. That argument feels silly to me because of the structure of the government,
Yeah, and I think that's what Gluckstein ends up saying here right after Kropotkin. So that's what I mean.
He's framing it
Yeah,
unfairly.
I agree, but I feel like it's intended to send shots toward anarchism in general.
Yeah.
Because he definitely has an anti-Proudhon bent throughout the text.
Certainly.
And I feel like where he is forgiving to socialists, he's forgiving to communists, he's not at all forgiving to the anarchists in a way that I think is obviously biased.
I think I would agree with you. I mean, his tone is clear. I don't even think that we have to kind of quibble about it. I think he's definitely an ML.
Yeah, I just wanted it to be said that if you are an anarchist coming to this book, The Paris Commune by Donny Gluckstein, prepare to feel attacked.
Yeah. Heavy is the head that wears the crown, It's so nice. It's so nice to read this from a perspective where I feel vindicated and not attacked.
Another, I think, very valid critique here about the commune in hindsight is the feminist critique.
Yes.
And I've been waiting to talk about
this. This is the big one.
So, someone named Gay Gullickson, a feminist who is generally sympathetic to the commune, wrote of the commune, quote, "Women were irrelevant. They were not members of the Central Committee, Communal Council, or National Guard who believed the problems of the working class family could be solved by getting the wife and mother out of the labor force and into the home. If they were workers, they should not be. Or to put it, as Jules Simon had in 1869, the woman who becomes a worker is no longer a woman." So there is a pretty strong feminist critique looking back, even though women were so central in the formation of the commune there was very clearly still sexist or misogynist attitudes that created a patriarchal power structure inside the commune that suggested that a woman's place is in the home, a woman's place is as a mother, not as a worker. And even that line from Jules Simon in 1869, the woman who becomes a worker is no longer a woman, is very telling.
Yeah.
And again, I think Gluckstein is way too much of an apologist toward this level of misogyny that was present. I don't know that I would say prevalent. I don't know enough to say that, but certainly was still present inside the commune. And I think it's too quick to say, like, shut up, feminists. Here's all the things that they actually did to help the women's liberation movement, and not actually legitimately respond to these criticisms. So the Women's Union Manifesto is quoted on 172. And the Women's Union says, "Union makes strength. In time of danger, all individual efforts must combine to form a collective, invincible resistance by the whole population." So there was very clearly a strong liberatory movement of women inside the commune that wanted to and saw the necessity of their participation as a part of the commune's success. Mm-hmm. But they were met with resistance inside the commune that I think is a legitimate criticism of what was happening there.
I would agree. I think on 172, just a little bit above where you were just reading, I think that becomes really clear.
Yeah.
Where he's saying that, well, first off, Donny Gluckstein says that the Protonists at the time challenged that view. They were saying that women should work, right? They weren't saying that it just needed to be in the home. Mm-hmm. But it's so funny the way he says that here. A Proudhonist, I suppose, named Les Français, whatever, man. Fuck the French. Okay, he said, one of the most important Proudhonists in the communal council says, women must have their political right based on liberty and equality. However, he also complained that, quote, until now, only a few people, like Leo Dubriel d'Erasmus, have expressed themselves in words and prints on the question. All the rhetoric raises only mediocre interest, which is so goofy. It's like...
It's so dismissive.
Yeah, it literally is.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's funny that Gluckstein is like, well, let's just examine the change in tone between March and May. It's like literally 2 months. I'm sure they didn't wake up, oh, women are people too. No. But just to... This isn't a devil's advocate thing, but like just to give Gluckstein some credence here, there is a part of me that agrees with his argument about creating an economically equal society. Like if we're thinking about the way that the society enforces or reinforces the norms, if there's a society in which women are economically equitable, does that lead to them being socially equitable? I think that's what Gluckstein's refutation of the argument here is, not that I necessarily think it's strong enough to overcome the fact that there's just base misogyny at play.
Yeah, that's a weak fucking take.
Yeah.
Economic equality might lead to social equality. I know for sure what will lead to social equality. Social equality,
yeah.
Just fucking do it.
Right. You know, I do agree with you that I think it's an apologetic take.
Yeah,
you know,
for sure. And again, he says on 173, this is Gluckstein directly, he says, in a moment of transition, elements from the past are intermingled together with those of the future. That feels very much like apologetics to me.
Yeah.
And again, I also wrote, why not afford this apology to anarchists? Because this is a good example of where I feel like he's being apologetic toward positions that are not worthy of apologetics.
Yeah. You know, it's an interesting question, just to step aside from the apologetics of it. I think it's an interesting question. If we're taking Lenin's position that, you know, not only will the state wither away, but also individual excess, you know, at what level do we consider those isms to be part of that individual excess? You know, I'm not advocating for the allowance of that kind of discrimination in society, but I don't know, there's a part of me that can see what he's saying here, that there will still be maybe echoes of the past in the current society. You know, just changing the structure around it, just changing the society isn't necessarily going to get rid of it. It will have to be hammered out.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do agree with that, because like you said, no one's going to wake up one day.
I'm a feminist now.
Yeah, women are people.
Oh my God.
And just suddenly come to that realization. It would be, one would hope that through the creation of a more egalitarian society where people's needs and concerns are considered, that it would become clearer and those things would kind of, like you said, wither away, much like the state apparatus might. I think that is probably likely. And I also don't want to characterize it as though everyone in the commune was some sort of raging misogynist or anything like that.
Yeah.
Because there were also pretty clearly sympathetic takes toward women's liberation.
I will say, just to double back, though, very funny talking back about the idea that women's theory so far has been mediocre and that's disqualifying to them. The very next line,
it makes one shudder.
Yeah, it makes one shudder to realize that critique was one of the most favorable speakers to the cause of women. And if that is true, then maybe everyone was a rampant misogynist.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly.
Like if like the best ally they can get is that kind of fucking backhanded,
super dismissive.
Yeah.
All their rhetoric raises only mediocre interest. Working men remain unmoved, and that is understandable.
That's understandable. You know what? Who could blame them? The workers can have a little misogyny as a treat.
What a fuck.
Yeah, I definitely am in agreement with you. Whereas I came prepared to fight a little more on Gluckstein's side, but now I'm like, no.
Yeah, and I mean, this section goes on for a few pages, and there are a lot of those lines. Like, okay, just to come back for a second.
Yes.
Maybe not everyone was a raging misogynist that was a part of the commune. There was written in La Sociale, the newspaper edited by some person named Leo, said...
That's one of the women in the women's union.
Okay. Said that democracy will only triumph with women on board.
Right.
And there was obviously also space for women in these red clubs or other spaces speaking to the council to express even farther left positions, or maybe farther right, depending on your view, like the positions on marriage and this block quote that we get about a woman that suggested that the matrimonial state is a perpetual crime against morality and must thus be eradicated.
Hell yeah.
Obviously,
fucking yeah.
Obviously, Gluckstein is right to say that the method of arresting people who choose to be married is obviously not a solution.
Oh, God.
But there was clearly space for women to participate in these discussions and to express ideas. And the fact that there were newspapers being printed by the women's union and other women participating in the women's liberation movement, all good.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like was mentioned before, these old attitudes aren't going to die immediately the day the commune occurs. And so what happened was Gluckstein even mentions a space where women who were formerly prostitutes were acting as nurses on the battlefields. Yeah. And we get this line from this person: the complexities were shown when these volunteers were badly received by some men on the grounds that they were, quote, they wanted pure hands to bandage the wounds. Fuck you.
Yeah. Just the page before where you were talking about Leo in La Sociale, she was saying that the women were being influenced by the reactionary Catholic establishment. The men were still holding chauvinistic beliefs.
Yeah.
It's like these old forces were still at play here.
Yep.
And again, it's a period of 2 months. Like,
yeah.
Imagine 3 months ago you were a misogynist. Like, that's not going to change. Even if you could be the most gung-ho about this new egalitarian society and still hold those beliefs.
Obviously as many were.
Yeah. Or you at least still have to now reckon with those beliefs in a way that you never had to before.
Yeah, and that's where I feel like Gluckstein is maybe a little too apologetic, where he creates too much space to be understandable of those attitudes rather than dismissive of them. He does say on page 175, in other words, the nourishment of new social relations gave both men and women real power to shape their destiny, and this took precedence over formal electoral matters. Being apologetic about the fact that women were not allowed to vote, there were not women on the council.
Right.
And he's like, well, it was still better for them.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you.
Weak.
To give him something, I'm thinking again about him, not him, but about Engels saying like it'll be a generational thing, like it'll have to take generations. I think Gluckstein is really willing to chalk it up to just the potential of the commune. And I think, just to talk again about that alt history, like what could have happened, if the commune were to have survived and somehow, I don't know, fought off France and I'm sure Germany and Spain and all of them, I think that the revolutionary force of the women in participation would have challenged those notions one way or the other, and that's kind of just where I feel about it. Like, I think his argument is silly here, but I do also see the idea of the potential of the commune as a whole, especially if they are changing these economic forms. However, if the formal definition is so negligible, then why not just do it?
Yeah.
If it's a non-issue, like if the economics superstructure is what lies underneath it, then just change the formal thing. Do you think that's going to be counter-revolutionary? Do you think that will inspire some kind of reaction? Or does it go hand in hand with the very economic change you're willing to create in the society?
Yeah.
That's exactly how I feel.
Yeah, I do think that he kind of ends this section by saying the Commune emphasized women's emancipation as part of a single unified movement for human liberation. And so I think that he comes to basically the same conclusion, but is, from my view, a little too allowing of the kind of misogyny that existed there.
Yeah. Word.
This Twilight or Dawn raised a question in my mind, but I don't know that we're going to be able to.
I'm not exactly does he mean that that's like I wasn't exactly sure of the point of that Twilight or Dawn, because he mentions that a couple times where he's saying, is it like the twilight of the old revolution or the dawn of a new one?
Yeah.
I mean, clearly it's the dawn of a new one.
Well, but what that got me thinking about was this idea of learning and studying history and using that as some sort of means of criticism to building a new revolution, right? Like you can't, obviously someone at some point had to build a revolution out of a vacuum, so to speak, or, ahistorically.
Yeah.
But we don't have to do that. We've seen attempted and successful revolutions occur. And so we can use those things looking backward to understand how to organize and maybe how to more successfully build a revolution moving forward. And so I think that this question of Twilight or Dawn is an interesting one because it also creates a potential to be too wedded to what happened previously to fully understand or interpret the situation at hand in modernity.
Yeah.
And so is the revolution, let's say the forthcoming proletarian revolution, an extension of the October Revolution?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or is it its
Right.
new thing?
Oh, yeah. No, I definitely understand that because, I don't know, man, maybe in 100 years someone will listen to this podcast and be like, it was simply the twilight of the Paris Commune.
Well, that's what I wrote, like, today and the Paris Commune. Like, what is the Paris Commune? What at the time of the Paris Commune was the first French Revolution. Like, are we looking backward at that as something from which to learn? So it was generally revered, even though many of its lessons were not directly applicable to a movement against capitalism.
Yeah.
Because I feel very much so that, like, the 80 years, whatever it was, between the French Revolution and the Paris Commune, obviously, French Revolution was formative in the movement of the Commune, even though society would have changed in that amount of time. In the 150 years since the Paris Commune, obviously, industrialization has moved us very far away from the time. Plus, the Western world in the United States is different than the Western world of Paris was at that time. And so, like, even though there might be lessons to be learned, what does that mean for us moving forward in the dawn of a new revolution? I think that's a question that's worth asking. I don't have an answer to it at all.
No, I totally agree. And, it kind of reminds me of that, like, any technology sufficiently advanced is indecipherable from magic. It's like the societal forms of the future are unknown to us. Like, we can only look at the forms of the past and maybe try to create forms that are either reflections of that or in opposition to those things.
Or an evolution of it or something.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're either adapting the old forms or creating a new form to run against it.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not like a scholar of this or anything, but I think that a lot of the new left movement of the, 60s, 70s, 80s was really concerned with that kind of idea, finding the new forms of society that could be put into play. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of that disorganization kind of led to that downfall, much in the same way that the disorganization of the commune may be looking for these new forms of government outside of the old forms, outside of like this old hierarchy. Even that bottom-up hierarchy from the National Guard led to their downfall, Because I think about that a lot, too. The fact that we're looking at these old models for our own society, our own predicament, our own conditions, is one that is always in my mind, especially being an American. America is such a different country because its whole basis education and history of like the population is completely different. Mm-hmm. America has no history outside of capitalism. That's simply it.
Yeah. Capitalist imperialism. Yeah.
Yeah. It's crazy. So I don't know. And I also think that, I don't know this wholeheartedly, but like, where does the commune lie in the popular imagination outside of communists? I don't think it has a place at all. I, for one, never had heard about it before. You know,
the Paris Commune specifically?
Yeah, I knew, like, I had heard the name the Paris Commune, but in my dumb brain, you know, I was like, is that the revolution? Is that what Les Mis is about? You know, like all of those things. I didn't know the dates or the time or anything. You know, it's certainly not taught. Like, I remember learning about the French Revolution in school, but I don't remember learning about the Commune. Obviously, it was a blip on the radar and not a deal in American education. But
yeah, I think you're right. If I learned about the French Revolution, which I can't say I did with absolute assurance, if I did, it was probably like a 1 or 2 day part of the larger unit.
They roll out the guillotines because she said, let them eat cake, and then the communists bad.
And then communists bad.
Yeah, it's like mob rule, you know? That's the lesson to be learned. It's like, yeah, the people rose up in terms of these big principles, but they couldn't do it just yet because they were terror. They did the terror. You know, like, that's all I remember from the French Revolution.
To your point about the popular conception of the Paris Commune, yeah, I don't think there is one in the United States,
Certainly
at least. And I think even if we're not talking specifically about the Paris Commune, if you say the word commune, the popular conception is certainly pejorative, and most definitely one likened to hippies in the 60s and that like New Love movement.
It's always in opposition to our society. Like, oh, fuck all this. I'll go off the grid and live on a commune.
Yep.
You know, like I feel like the word commune is been purposely abstracted from society to the point where it can only be laughed at.
Yes.
You know?
There was actually a quote about education way back when in the first chapter that I think is applicable here. I'm glad that we got a chance to come back to it.
Oh, yeah.
The commission after the commune, which was apparently being advised by André Leo, the writer we were just talking about, and some other person, Edouard Vaillant. I don't know how to speak French. I'm terrible at French. But education was one of the 9 commissions through the commune, and they suggested, the paragraph ends with this quote, any official direction which is imposed on the judgment of the pupil is fatal and must be condemned. It tends to destroy individuality. We declare that, due to the principle of equality, the commune owes to every one of its members free education at all levels. And when you were talking about your education and around the French Revolution, that just spoke to me because it was kind of like, not to quote Chomsky, an Epstein apologist, but like this idea in the United States, education is really primarily about manufacturing consent. It's really just about creating workers that do not question the conditions that they're being forced into, don't have a worldly enough understanding of their place in it to ever do any form of revolution. And this idea that the commune owes to every person a free education that does not destroy individuality. I just like that.
No. I'm just thinking, like, I don't want to say like the blanket generalization that like being well educated leads to being like a progressive, but it really does feel like that a lot, especially when you're talking about, maybe not history is the best example, but it's really tough to study history and not be like, damn, man, the forces of capital seem to be the worst forces every single time.
Yep.
You know, especially once you just start to look at the connections between imperialism and capitalism.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's impossible to deny. You know, the funniest thing was when Victoria 3 came out. It's a game that's basically a world economics simulator. You like pick a country, you build industry and shit like that, and it goes from 1836 to 1936. And the funniest thing is that they tried to model resource distribution in the world accurately. So you can get oil and you can get rubber, but it ain't in Europe, you know, it ain't in the US, right? And so there were posts on Reddit that were like, how can I get rubber without doing colonialism? How can I get oil without invading another country that goes against, you know, what I'm trying to play as? And you know, all the communists in the comments are just like, oh boy, like, you know, like, that's the thing. It's like, how can you not? I feel like if the education is truly free, open, and accessible, and that exactly what she's saying here, then like, you will align yourself with...
What other conclusion is there?
Yeah, exactly. And I know that that's like a little pipe dreamy, right? But that's simply how I feel, you know? Do the fucking reading and maybe you'll understand it.
Yep.
Yeah. That wasn't towards any of you listeners. You're clearly with us on that. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention is that in the destruction of the commune, a lot of times a revolution is won not because you win the fight, but because the opposing force won't fight you. You know what I mean? Like, I was reading The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber, which is a book where he's looking at the history of inequality And he says that. He says revolutions are often won because an army says we're not going to fire on our own people here. And I think a really interesting point that he makes, the forces that were willing to fire on the citizens of Paris were colonial forces. Okay? What can explain the enormous scale of brutality visited upon the Parisian working class? Firstly, as a survivor wrote, the army commanded had honed its techniques of repression in colonial campaigns. They were now accustomed to, quote, subjecting the beautiful Arab races to the most revolting treatment and most odious extermination. In fact, after having spent years setting fire to Algerian villages and massacring the tribespeople, the soldiers were well trained in spilling the blood in our cities. So it's like that old idea that fascism is imperialism come home. You know what I mean? It's like they were so ruthless, disgusting, and violent because they were already trained to oppressing another class of people. And that just really stuck with me. It's like they were so brutal because they were colonial forces. You know, I don't know. That just really stuck with me here.
Yeah, that's powerful.
Yeah. It's fucked.
This is how the book ends.
Yes.
He gives us this block quote. He calls the last wish of the communards. I'm not sure exactly where it comes from. J. Vallis.
Man, I have no idea.
I don't know who that is either. Anyway, whatever may happen, whether or not we will be defeated once more and be dead tomorrow, our generation is consoled. We are paid back after 20 years of defeats and anguish. Bugles blow in the wind. Drums strike up the rhythm. Comrade, you have gray hair like me. Let's embrace. And you, young kid, playing marbles behind the barricade, come here so that I can embrace you too. The 18th of March has indeed saved you, young fellow. You could, like us, have grown up lost in the fog, wallowing in the mud, rolling about in blood, dying of shame and the indescribable pain of humiliation. That's over. We have bled and cried for you. You will inherit the fruits of our efforts. Child of desperation, you will be free.
Oh, fucking yeah.
Yeah, that's fucking great.
Yeah. I mean, you know, maybe chalk it up to the French language or whatever, but a lot of these quotes were just full of romanticism.
Oh, big time.
Absolutely gorgeous, you know, pulling at my heartstrings.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to the way we wrap up every episode. First, is this book worth reading?
Yeah, I really did think it was worth reading.
Yeah.
I think I'm not a person that reads a lot of history, straight history, I guess, but I did find it very compelling and easy to read.
I would agree. I know nothing about the French history. That's just a fact. As I've said, I knew nothing about this commune. I knew nothing about the revolution. And I think that this was a really digestible way to get into it. You know, it gave me the broad strokes of the whole thing. It didn't get too mired in the details. It talked about all the parts I was looking for, and it did it in a way that was, you know, pretty entertaining. Donny Gluckstein, not without his Trotskyist faults. I'm just kidding. I think it's a pretty succinct history. I really enjoyed it there. The focus is on the commune. That's really the nicest thing about it. It's taking the position of a communard. Like, it's taking the position of somebody whose main point of this book is the commune. So for what we were looking for, I think it was exactly what we needed, you know?
Yeah, I do feel it helped me contextualize what actually happened around the Paris Commune quite a lot, which made it a lot easier to contextualize the stuff that we've read so far, which I thought was helpful. And I thought he wrote it in a way that was very approachable as someone that's not, you know, deeply mired in the reading of history. It not being just a dry chronological telling of the events did help me get through it. I also felt like he almost, through, you know, his focus on the factions within the commune, created a cast of characters that made it easier to understand what was happening.
Yeah.
And how that back and forth was, that dynamic was working in a way that made it easier for me to understand. So, yeah, would recommend.
Yeah, even to talk about, you know, studying history as the blueprint. I mean, having read Lenin, Marx, or Engels, I guess, you know, talking about the Paris Commune directly, it was really nice to see those exact principles of, you know, they made a workman's salary, they were all revocable, it was massively democratic. I mean, those things in action. I mean, it was really nice. And I just wish it had not lasted 2 months and then obliterated.
Yeah.
You know?
What questions did this reading leave you with?
How the fuck do you win a revolution? That's the biggest question I had, you know? say a massive revolutionary event happens, then what? Right? The model of the Paris Commune is a decent one, but clearly not without its own faults. Is the answer as simple as just be more actionable? Just, I don't know, be more iron-fisted? Isn't that how we ended up with Stalin?
Yeah.
That's my question now.
Yeah, I think the questions that primarily resonated with me while I was reading and are still banging around in my head right now are around the People's Militia, which we talked about a little bit. But what does that look like? What should that look like? What does it mean to have an armed populace? How does that work in opposition to a militia or army as, an apparatus of the state? And I think I got an answer to the latter question, but the former, I'm not sure I've fully formed. I've fully developed a response to that.
As a corollary, if we're also creating an armed militia, how does that dovetail with issues of like misogyny? I mean, I think that that's a really clear example that we saw in the Paris Commune is that their structure was based on the army and thus it was all men.
Yeah.
Well,
I do think that we have modern representations, like we made mention of the protracted People's War in the Philippines, which is an egalitarian army. So
it's true, but I just chuckled at that egalitarian army.
Hey, equal rights, equal fights.
Yeah. Oh God, you sound like a student, man. Certainly, though, I do agree. It is a people's militia.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
Yeah. So that was one question that, I don't know, as a person who doesn't own any guns and has not in the last 20 years ever shot a gun, it did make me wonder about what that actually looks like to have a people's militia.
Yeah. Is having my riflery merit badge from the Boy Scouts enough?
You were a Boy Scout?
I was.
That somehow doesn't surprise me, but I'm surprised I didn't know.
Well, primarily I did it because all my friends did it. In fact, when they left, my mom got really pissed because I was like, I made
you don't want to do it anymore.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah. And I made no progression. She thought I was going to be an Eagle Scout. That was her desire to put me in the Boy Scouts because it's like something you put on your resume. I didn't give a fuck about that. So I ranked up once to tenderfoot and then I never again. Like I didn't give a damn,
Tenderfoot.
I just did it with my friends and I went, summer camp was really fun. You got the merit badges. That was cool. I got to shoot guns and bows and arrows and stuff and hang out with my buddies in camp. That was awesome. Everything else was really shit,
My neighbor did it very briefly, like maybe stuck with it for one summer or something like that. And I remember being very jealous.
It was a lot of fun. You just need people to do it. Like all of the values in Scouts, it's definitely Christian coded. I'll say that much.
Yeah, 100%.
100%. They're like good values, it seeks to teach like proper things, but I don't know, it's there's like cool stuff there, and it was nice I was not an outdoor kid, and so that was definitely part of the reason my mom liked that I did it so much, because it got me outdoors.
The other big question that I think was obviously a part of the downfall of the commune that I think should resonate with any potential future revolutionary action,
not by us,
we're not going to participate in that,
is covered
this question of like the balance, right? Like balancing, progressing the movement, that the revolutionary movement that you have created forward, moving that forward while also defending it from the outside. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And like finding the balance between how to do both of those things. Like you made mention the Soviet Union going effectively bankrupt. Yeah. Participating in an arms race that they had no interest in participating in.
Yeah. They didn't even seek to win it. They just wanted to survive.
Yeah. And obviously, like the question of the commune, the Paris Commune, and their willingness or ability to move forward while also defending themselves from fears. Yeah. I think that that's like an open question that needs to be on everyone's radar moving forward. So I think that's an important one to think about, like, because capitalism and socialism can't coexist next to one another without conflict.
Right.
How do you manage any sort of socialist project that is socialist in its endeavor while also defending itself against capitalist imperialist defense?
Yeah. History has numerous examples and none of them are pretty. You know, you can see it in both directions, either too open or too closed off. I mean, like North Korea comes to my mind because they grappled with that question in a very military fashion and look where they're at. They are safe, quote unquote, secure, quote unquote, and independent, quote unquote. But look at them. I mean, they're certainly a stunted monster of ideology at this point, at least.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I feel. And it comes from them answering that question, how can we be safe? That's how. The problem is, look at them now. and that really sucks. On the flip side, right, countries that maybe acted in a fashion that secured themselves later on in history were still undermined. They were still dissolved. I mean, they still were changed by the outside forces of capitalism. Maybe. I mean, I simply don't know enough. But like, I'm thinking about like Vietnam,
Cambodia,
yeah, even Cuba to an extent. Like,
Cuba, big time.
Yeah,
the embargo.
Yeah, they have all been changed. They have all survived, but at what cost? It's like, how do you do a revolution and get away with something besides a Pyrrhic victory? That's a really tough one, you know. And so history is littered with those examples. So that's a big question in my mind too.
Yeah. We kind of answered this one indirectly already. I don't know if it's worth asking, but what is to be gained from reading this text?
A lot. I mean, I don't think we really need to answer because what is to be gained is why we read it.
Everything else that we already said.
Yeah.
So that was The Paris Commune, A Revolution in Democracy by Donny Gluckstein.
Donny Gluckstein, if you listen to this, let us know what you thought, and everyone else at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
That's right. And for the next episode, we have decided that we're going to read something from my favorite bread boy, Peter Kropotkin. Both of us have, I think, read at least some of this previously, but we're going to dive into the whole thing and discuss it on the next one. We're going to read
The Conquest of Bread. That's right.
Very excited.
Yeah. For one, it's a text that could still go hand in hand with what we want, especially because, and as I've said this before on the show, his thesis is pretty good. It's that, anarchism begets communism. Communism begets anarchism.
Yep.
I think that hopefully what we'll find is that, the end goal of I think it's exactly what we've been saying, is that the end goal is the same. It's just a question of how we get there.
Yeah.
I've expressed before that I think this book is a little idealistic. I'm hoping that on second read, maybe my opinions will have been changed.
Especially now that we've contextualized it so much around the Paris Commune and now the October Revolution. Yeah. Now we can see a more anarcho-communist take. And maybe it won't seem so idealistic.
Yeah, I definitely was still a naive Marxist the first time I read this. Maybe I was a sock dem. Like, he's a trot! This has been
Left Unread. Bye.
See ya. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, le baguette. Okay, I'm sorry.